Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko at Houston, Texas.
And today we're joined by Professor Greg Shupak, who is a returning guest to the Green and Red podcast. He teaches media studies at the University of Guelph-Humber in Toronto. And he's also the author of The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. And then he also publishes regularly on issues around Palestine, Israel, and the media. I just actually had a recent article in Al Jazeera, which we're actually going to be talking about today. But just to give a quick little background, it's been a year since the war of genocide began in Gaza. The war has also expanded. The Israelis have expanded the war into Lebanon, the West Bank, Yemen, Iran. And so we talked with Professor Shupak last November, I believe, about the role the media played in the Israel-Palestine conflict. So we're going to talk about it again because I think it's very important. And maybe I'll kick off with a question is, what are you making of the media coverage right now, probably in the last month or so, as far as the genocide and the conflict in the Middle East goes?
I think, there's a lot to be said. I think that you're getting a pretty radical underreporting of what's been happening in Gaza. I said this on another interview I did, but it's becoming very much of a dog bites man story in the sense that it doesn't seem to be worthy of much attention in the eyes of those who decide what gets on the front cover or even in the paper at all or on the nightly news at all, because it's been going on now for nearly 13 months. And it's horrifically troubling because, of course, this is a genocide that we're talking about with regard to Gaza. It's not something that, if we were to take journalists and those who run news outlets at their word that what they're interested in doing is playing an important role in the functioning of democracy and generating an informed citizenry, then if you were genuinely committed to that, would never allow genocide to become just a boring story that people are sick of hearing of and leave it at that. You'd be banging the drum on that repeatedly and endlessly, as a lot of independent news outlets have. With regard to, just for example, some of the massacres in northern Gaza and the imminent risk of death of potentially everyone living there, according to a UN statement issued a couple of days ago, this is hundreds of thousands of people who have had effectively, more than 200,000 people, I should say, who've had effectively very little or almost no access to food for the entire month of October, at least with no aid being allowed in. Relentless bombing and many reports of just basically shooting anybody who moves, coming from the few journalists that are in Gaza, and also those who don't live there currently but have family inside who are sometimes able to get communications to them. We're really seeing, in some ways, maybe talking about the worst phase is a pointless game, but we're seeing as bad of atrocities as we've seen at any point. It's not as if the violence has somehow died down or petered out. Quite the contrary. And that's to say nothing of southern Gaza or the rest of Gaza, where there's all kinds of ongoing bombings as well, not to mention quite considerable risks in terms of lack of access to food, medicine, or water. And that's only touching on Gaza. I think what has gotten more attention recently has been, if you go back to late September, early October, the Lebanon got a fair bit of attention. But again, even that seems to be receding from the headlines and not generating, say, a whole lot of op-ed coverage in the newspapers at this point. It seems that when there is space for Lebanon or Gaza in the American media or the other parts of the English-speaking Western world, it's kind of metabolized through U.S. election coverage. So it's considered important insofar as it affects, say, the presidential race in Michigan, for example, where there's, of course, a large Arab American and Muslim American population. I think you have Israel bombing World Heritage sites at least twice in the last week in Lebanon, and that barely breaks into media discourse. But what has gotten more attention at times in the last week and a bit has been the Iran dimension to the story. Of course, when Iran carried out its strikes on Israel at the beginning of October in retaliation for Israel killing Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and also for what Israel has been doing in Gaza and Lebanon, that generated quite a bit. And I wrote about this for Fair. That generated quite a bit of attention in the kind of media pundit sphere, where you had all kinds of calls for radical escalation of the war on Iran. Of course, this is all misframed as though Iran were carrying out military actions against Israel unprovoked or without any kind of context. So you have the Wall Street Journal and Bret Stephens at the New York Times and Max Boot at the Washington Post calling for, and the Boston Globe editorial board as well, calling for not only continued Israeli violence against Iranian targets, but all deepened U.S. involvement as well. So there was any source of advocacy for attacking Iranian military sites, as Israel did indeed attempt to do last Friday, and also for, in some cases, attacking Iranian nuclear facilities. All of this buttressed by this highly misleading rhetoric that would suggest Iran is either has or is about to have some sort of nuclear weapon arsenal, which just isn't the case. With this Iran coverage, it's been a lot of, they'll refer back to the April attack that Iran carried out against Israel. And again, they'll frame that as, this is the Wall Street Journal, I'm thinking of, for example, they'll say, Iran has now attacked Israel twice in the last few months, and then early April is the other one, but they won't mention that a few days, the whole reason that Iran fired back at Israel was because Israel had bombed an Iranian diplomatic building in Syria, killing high-ranking Iranian officials. There's this pattern that we see, whether it's Gaza or Lebanon or Yemen or Iran or anywhere, Syria, to frame it as, Israel's defending itself. Israel is responding to or retaliating to strike against its adversaries, when in reality, these parties are retaliating to some U.S.-Israeli aggression. There's been, I would say, a shortage of coverage of a lot of the worst facets of the regional conflicts that have been unfolding, and the coverage that does exist has been full of lies of commission and also lies of omission, and very much in the framework of, if not explicitly encouraging further U.S.-Israeli aggression, then at least buttressing a climate that would enable passive acceptance of that, or an inability, or I should say, erecting a kind of barrier to understanding the real dynamics that have played out, which is U.S.-Israeli attempts to control the region through force and attempts by local actors to resist that. I'm glad, just as a final note on this question, that you mentioned the West Bank, because I think that's totally been overshadowed as well. The more than 700 dead in the West Bank, killed by Israel since October 7th, 2023. That in itself is a huge number. And that's to say nothing of the many thousands of arrests, which are really just disappearances, people snatched away by Israeli forces with no real legal legitimacy. And this is very much part of the equation, but it really doesn't register here. It's talked about, Gaza gets talked about sometimes, but as is so often the case, it's treated as this totally separate island unto itself that's not connected to the rest of Palestine in present or historically.
When we spoke last year, it was pretty early in all of this, and we were already then talking about the stories or lies that Israel had put forward. They blamed Hamas for blowing up a hospital and for events of October 7th. We now know that Israel's blown up pretty much every hospital in almost all of Gaza, especially, and we know about the Hannibal Directive. And yet the media, in many ways, is still reporting these things, even though we now have evidence that they've been debunked, that they're not true. Why is that? Do they actually just ideologically believe in that? Or are they under pressure to continue to ignore certain realities of it? Why is it continued after all this time, even though we now have proof in front of us that these things just didn't happen the way that they were suggesting that they did?
Yeah, that's an interesting question that I think has no single simple answer and is due to the sort of, it's all of the above. I think that one of the most interesting things is that with regard to the Hannibal Directive, what we know about that kind of in the English-speaking sort of Western world comes from a combination of independent media sources like Electronic Intifada and Mondoise, and basically what Israeli media has reported. And some of that's in Hebrew, some of that's in English, some of that is through Haaretz investigation, and others is from basically things that military officials have told journalists in Israel, or what Israelis have described witnessing on October 7th. It is significant, and I think in some ways curious that can get through in Israel, but not here. And I'm not about to praise Israeli media, some sort of paragon of openness and investigation, but I think that it maybe illustrates just how much self-censorship and possibly other forms of censorship we have in American and also Canadian media. I think there's the old the Chomsky thing where he's doing an interview and somebody on, I think it was like Dutch television, it was a European channel of some sort, and they said, "Oh, are you saying that I don't believe what I'm sitting here saying?" And he says, "No, I'm sure you're perfectly sincere in your beliefs. My point is, you wouldn't be sitting, if you didn't believe what you believe, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair." So yeah, there is a kind of pre-screening of people to get into these positions as New York Times editors or columnists at the Washington Post or whatever, where they're simply not going to hire in the present or past context somebody who is opposed to Zionism and U.S. imperialism. And that doesn't mean that no criticisms and get through and no questions get asked, but it does help explain, I think, a lot about how these often false claims or half-truths about not only October 7th, but many other things get through. And yeah, I think that we can't begin to seriously answer this question if we don't look at the political economy of news media and its deep embeddedness within the U.S. ruling class in both the sort of corporate economic sphere and also the political elites as well, where you have a revolving door at times between people going from boards of directors of major corporations that deal in products other than news and then going to work for news media outlets too. So you have an ideological orientation, but also a very material groundedness that guides the people who shape what gets into the media and what doesn't. And that, I think, should lead us to think of mass mainstream media as one branch of the ruling class political and economic activity. It's not merely just its kind of propaganda arm, but it is yet another one of its economic activities, in the sense that news outlets are themselves often big business, and they likewise are embedded in other economic activities. So if you look at who invests in news media outlets and who owns them, you often have money directly coming from weapons firms or from firms that are themselves also linked to weapons businesses, even if they don't themselves make it. So there's good material interest for these places to want to buttress imperialism and U.S. imperialism, of which Zionism is a key plank. So I think that those are some of the underlying reasons that help us understand that. And because Zionism has been called into question publicly by more people than ever before, I think a lot of its strongest supporters, whether that's because of a ideological commitment to Zionism per se, or to U.S. imperialism and Israel as an adjunct of that, I think that they're feeling a little bit of pressure, possibly at times even panic, to see so much of the population, particularly among younger people, really calling into to question the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. And for that reason, all of this censorship on universities, of course, and also in media at times. And I think this just creates this broader chilling effect, this broader climate where people, whenever they may believe, are afraid of sanction for questioning official narratives, especially ones that are radioactive, like the atrocity propaganda surrounding October 7th, which I think, I should say, is straightforwardly the function of repeating the claims, the most lurid claims about October 7th over and over again, including those which don't stand up to scrutiny. It's just to try to legitimize the genocide by saying, look, this is Hamas and they're savage barbarians. They therefore cannot play any role in representing the Palestinian people. They therefore can never be allowed to govern Gaza. They therefore can never be allowed to even exist as a political group. So Israel and the U.S. have no choice but to get rid of them at all costs, even if that means exterminating Palestinians along with them, who, by the way, are also guilty because they voted for Hamas, because many opinion polls suggest, support armed struggle as undertaken by Hamas and other groups. So I think that the function of atrocity propaganda, independent of its truth value or lack thereof, is always to justify brutal violence against one party to an armed conflict. And I think that is even more stark by and large in colonial warfare, where you have such intense racism that you get these sort of wildly invented tales, 40 babies and so forth, or going back to sort of European colonization about Africa, some of these manufactured tales of cannibalism and these types of things. Yeah, that to me is very clearly the function, to try to provide a kind of civilization versus barbarism, to suggest that Israel and the United States need to keep the barbarians at the gate, when in fact it seems quite the opposite, that the regional forces resisting them need to protect themselves from those who are meting out savage violence from Israel and America, and also its partners, including Canada, which supports Israel in all manner of ways also.
Talking about the atrocity propaganda, we're largely talking about like legacy media, establishment media. How did the social media companies buy into this? On the surface, it comes across as like egalitarian, that anyone can post something and be able to comment on it. But we go with the way in which the algorithms work, that's not the case. And so how much have you seen the atrocity propagandas play out?
Yeah, it's hard to say just in terms of my own experience, because my own algorithms are mostly, although I think less so than in the past, geared towards what I'm interested in. But yeah, I think that's absolutely in the immediate days and weeks following last October 7th, the whole media terrain, whether social media or legacy media, was absolutely flooded with sensationalistic claims about, cooking people, beheaded babies, orders for mass systemic sexual assaults. And the social media, I think, has a valuable function for propaganda because it's so relentless in the sense that it's a cliche, but if people look around look out your window and you'll see everybody is standing there looking at their phone. It's when you can get those images being driven home over and over again to shore up this notion, this kind of frankly rather old notion of the barbarian from the Orient who worships violence for its own sake. That's social media can be really useful in that way. And I think we've seen that at least in the case of Facebook and, well, Meta, I guess I should say, Facebook and Instagram, and then Twitter or X, we've had a lot of cases of either people being temporarily suspended or worse, suspended or kicked off, I should say, for a longer term, or images that get content notes attached to them when they're just like sharing something about, say, Palestinian victims, flags attached to this content suggesting that it can't be, that it violates community standards in some way. It's hard because this is all very opaque, exactly how their algorithms work. It's not like they make it public information. But I think that it's been the kind of 1-2 punch of saying, on the one hand, when the shock of October 7th was still fresh, just bombard people with the most contextualized, sensationalistic possible claims about alleged war crimes carried out by Palestinians. And then after that, shift to censorship and doxing and other forms of attack on people who are either pushing back against the conventional narrative about October 7th or trying to just bring to light the outrages that Israel and the United States carried out subsequently. And there seems to be a lot of data suggesting that this is why people have, or this is one reason why TikTok has gained in strength as compared to these other companies, because specifically on Palestine, they have not shied away from enabling a pro-Palestine narrative to flourish, basically. And as I'm sure you've heard, we've seen some of the leaders of Zionist organizations in the United States and pro-Israel politicians talking about the need to basically stop stop TikTok for precisely that reason. So there's been some speculation, and it's not very...
They probably help the Israeli soldiers and post their atrocities to TikTok.
Yeah, I wish I had mentioned, so thank you for bringing that up. That's a really fascinating element of the whole thing, is just how much they're building hopefully future prosecutors in war crimes tribunals evidence dossiers by just constantly posting their own horrific crimes and bragging about them. And yeah, that's a fascinating element of it too, right? Social media is it has so many moving parts that it's hard to isolate one element of social media and say, this is the defining characteristic of it. But yeah, amongst everything else I've said, that Israeli forces have helped inadvertently push back on their own narrative by just gleefully broadcasting their own brutality to the whole world.
I'm going to be a little contrarian on this, because I actually think social media has been really important and provided a service to all this, because there are suspensions and cancellations and images being flagged and all that. Absolutely. Musk and Zuckerberg to me and Bezos are like wickedly dangerous people. But at the same time, what I know about what's really happening there has come through. It hasn't come through the mainstream media. I see images all the time of Israel actually taking losses, which I don't think I've ever seen in the mainstream media. Israel units are being attacked, people are being bought, people are being killed. And then, as you pointed out, bragging. The way I look at it is, if social media didn't exist, it's hard to say it would be much worse, because it's as bad as you could be. But it seems like we're relying on that now to get the information we need, because we're not going to get it from the Washington Post, at CNN, or whatever.
Yeah, that's quite right. And I regret that I didn't mention that either, because that is absolutely true. I think it is there's been independent journalism and alternative media since the printing press existed, but it obviously can travel much faster and much more widely in the era of social media. Social media is a very contradictory media, but it does have, it was a mistake to leave that out. That it is no doubt a very useful tool, or can be, and it has absolutely been crucial in getting out the counter propaganda and even just communicating raw information, because so many of the people who are the Gaza journalists, like some of them work for or are connected with, say, Al Jazeera in some way, or Palestinian media outlets, but a lot of them are currently or started out as just ordinary citizen journalists. So just people with a phone. So yeah, it's vital. And it is true that while it's a site of struggle, right? It's like most cultural institutions and apparatuses, you have space for resistance and you have space for the hegemonic powers to seek to clamp down and assert their control. We see this in universities too, for instance. And I think that there's absolutely indispensable work that happens on social media, both in Gaza and internationally, that is, as you say, I think one of the, if not the prime ways that the propaganda has been delegitimized. And I think that just anecdotally, from what I see amongst students or younger people I encounter through campus life, it's, overwhelmingly the source that younger pro-Palestinian people rely on to get their information. And the kind of legacy media try to paint that as an intrinsically bad thing. Oh, wow, there's no traditional journalistic safeguards on social media, which is true, but the safeguards don't work super well in legacy media. And furthermore, people can take to and do take to all the time social media and independent media to cite very credible sources, because people can access all kinds of material and can read. And one of the central fallacies that comes up in criticizing or just even reflecting on the role of news media is this magic bullet theory that proposes people are going to just automatically be dupes who believe everything they read and hear. And that's just not the way that it works, right? Propaganda is not a magic bullet that once it inserts itself into someone's body, they automatically are brainwashed. And just because people see things on social media or conventional media, they don't necessarily believe it. And I think that typically what we've seen as widely shared social media getting out crucial information on Gaza has been, broadly speaking, quite accurate. And that's a real credit to the people involved and absolutely indispensable. And it speaks to the need to not have social media in the hands that it's currently in, because it can be, and sometimes is, a very valuable asset for making the world a better place. It's just that it's often obstructed because the people who run these sites don't want that to be what they're used for.
Yeah, I don't want to defend Twitter and Instagram. Like, for example, like when you publish a new article, like I immediately see 3 or 4 different places. And I'd probably find it, but I'd have to go looking for it. I'd have to say, oh, let me check out Al Jazeera. Let me check out that electron. And I guess this really stems from a place that the main media is so bad. It's just atrocious. Worse than the Vietnam era, I believe, right? That last thing I was teaching yesterday, I was mentioning Vietnam and the My massacre. And it hit me that was a year before anybody even touched that. It took a year for first to get the story, and then much longer to actually do a real investigation. Like today, that would be pretty much instantaneous. Somebody would probably post images from My. One of the dumb soldiers would be bragging about it, right? I think that because the main media is so bad, that's actually been providing a service to us.
So in your recent article on Al Jazeera, you talked about how the media is tied to Incites Genocide. You talk about Greg Gordon, who has a view that free speech can incite atrocity and genocide. Tell us a little bit about Gordon's approach and then also how Western media plays into that.
Sure. So the first kind of instance of the concept of incitement to genocide, at least under international law, is, like with most international law that's relevant today, born in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust in particular. And so at that point, the Nazi propaganda that was being tried in the Nuremberg trials was very crude. It was just explicit calls in some cases for exterminating Jewish people and other perceived enemies. By the time of the tribunals, for the international tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, there was a challenge because there wasn't generally the same kind of overt calls for slaughter. And we can ignore for the moment the fact that those conflicts, particularly in Yugoslavia, have more dynamics and complexities than is generally understood anyway. But leaving that aside, what Gordon, who was a prosecutor in the Rwanda tribunal, what he put forth is basically the idea that it would be most productive to think through the concept of hate speech as a form of incitement to genocide, so that things like dehumanizing language can be seen as a form of incitement to genocide. And so I think you've seen plenty of this in the case of Palestine coverage since October 7th, referring to Hamas and in some cases Palestinians generally as just irrationally violent, unwilling to even protect their own people from mass murder. Gordon introduces concepts like dehumanization that we're quite familiar with, but he introduces them to the discourse of incitement to genocide. Likewise, and he's not the only, the other scholars have done work along these lines too, but there's other concepts like just openly rationalizing mass and frankly genocidal violence that he argues amounts to a form of incitement to genocide. And I think that's quite useful because essentially what it's saying is, these slaughters are quite legitimate. There's nothing to worry about here. And in fact, it's good for these to continue. I should specify that the kind of justifications he's talking about are moral and ethical justifications, not just military justifications, but the justifications that say it's too bad that there's a lot of dead Palestinians, but it's really Hamas's fault. That's just the kind of way of attempting to come up with an ethical justification to say Israel and the United States have to keep doing what they're doing, or at least that it's justifiable for them to keep doing what they're doing because what they're doing isn't causing Palestinians to die. It's what Hamas is doing that's causing Palestinians to die. That's one form of the kind of ethical rationalization that they come up with. So for Gordon, that's a form of incitement to genocide, saying, hey, these are morally defensible actions. Therefore, there's no reason to seek to stop them. I think likewise, blaming or celebrating, I didn't really get to this in the article, but celebrating figures who have carried out mass atrocities is another form of genocide incitement, according to Gordon. So again, I didn't cover this in the article, but it's not unlike what in some of the parts of Eastern Europe now, where there's these attempts to rehabilitate Nazi war criminals as nationalist heroes instead. That, in a kind of arguably underhanded way, is a way of justifying those crimes, of justifying the Holocaust and other atrocities by saying, oh, actually, these guys were patriotic heroes.
And that could apply to the American Republican Party as well. So
for sure, yeah. Or for that matter, the American Democratic Party, when people, praising those who are responsible for mass murder. And so you get plenty of praise of the IDF in American media or Israeli political figures, not necessarily the current ones. Netanyahu's not very popular in the United States or its media, but they'll refer back to all more leaders they perceive as visionary Israeli leaders like Rabin, they'll describe as a dove and who pursued peace and so forth. This is a guy who not only ordered to break the bones of Palestinians, but also helped carry out some of the atrocities of the Nakba. So celebrating war criminals and perpetrators of genocide is a way of inciting further genocide by saying, look, these people are heroes. And what did the heroes do? They committed acts of genocide. So that's another facet of Borden's argument that I didn't actually have time to get to in that piece, or space to get to, I should say. And yeah, I think that this expansive definition of genocide is well worth considering, because I think that in the 21st century, a lot of the most dangerous rhetoric is coded and not necessarily difficult to decode, but it's just a step removed from saying, let's go kill them all. Plenty of Israeli politicians have said just that, essentially, but that's not what we're talking about here. I think the other point I tried to make in the Al Jazeera piece, or one of the other points I tried to make there, was that it's not only the case that genocidal propaganda or incitement to genocide needs to take the form of saying, okay, citizens who are listening to this, pick up a weapon and go kill some Palestinians or whatever other peoples we may be thinking of in other cases. That doesn't need to happen when it comes to an American audience, because American participation in the genocide is at a remove from the American citizenry. That's if we leave out the many American citizens who are either in the Israeli military or carrying out pogroms on the West Bank. But by and large, the main contribution of America to the genocide is funding, intelligence sharing, political cover. And so what's necessary for Americans to participate in the genocide is to just, if not agree with, at least acquiesce to what their government does. And that is what is in effect by a lot of the media. It can just take the form of muddying the waters enough even to ensure that the population is, or that a critical mass of the population is going to be quiet enough to allow this to unfold. Certainly there's been tons of opposition in America, but obviously thus far, the policy continues. So I think that this broadening the definition of genocide in the way that Gordon does is useful. And I think that it is relevant to talk about not only how, say, Israeli media has incited genocide, but also how American media, because without America, there is no genocide being carried out by Israel.
I'm going to try to merge two or three ideas together because we don't have a ton of time left. I think Al Jazeera recently did a report, I think was specifically about CNN, but it was called Failing Gaza Behind the Lens of Western Media, where they talked to people like from these news organizations who complained about what they were doing internally. And we'd see a few instances where people would complain about that. But compared to, say, liberals who were like just apoplectic about Bezos' refusal to do an endorsement, it's pretty minimal. Do you see like a lot of internal tension in these media outlets between people who are fed up with these people, the editors and the publishers, just basically becoming propagandists for the IDF or for whoever? What you just said a minute ago reminded me, at Nuremberg, there were Nazi propagandists who theoretically never picked up a rifle who were convicted of war crimes and genocide. So do you think there's a discussion or an argument going on in newsrooms across America about this?
And I should say in Rwanda as well, there were radio broadcasters were without necessarily participating directly in the violence. Yeah, it's honestly, it seems like you've had more resignations from the State Department than you've had from media outlets. And I'm the last person who's going to say much about, I don't think that the State Department is overrun with the most principled, conscientious people with commitments to liberating the colonized or anything. But I think rather the opposite, that it just speaks to how rotten a lot of these media outlets are. And a lot of look, there's people who have integrity and do good work there and so forth. And yes, to a point, you can understand people's needs to stay employed and so forth. But on the other hand, ideally, especially in a job that is supposed to be about holding the powerful to account, ideally, if you're taking up that mantle, there ought to be a red line where at what point are you so far away from that you aren't willing to lose your job if that's what it takes and try to find some other work? Why do you even want to do that work to serve genocidal propaganda? So I got to say, it's the same with academics too. There's only so far I can go with being understanding of the sort of need for professional self-preservation, because you would like to think eventually some amount of concern for stopping with whatever resources you have at your disposal what's happening, or if not stopping, at least trying to make some minor dent in the machinery that allows it to happen. Yeah, I think the short answer to your question is I see very little of that. Again, you get it from time to time, the odd report. The Guardian had a big one on people being frustrated at CNN. They had that back in February, I think. And I think it was the New York Times. We had a report somewhere about people working at the Times being frustrated and fed up, but I'm not seeing a lot of mass resignations from there. As I said, I've seen more from the State Department, and these people went along with a lot of horrific crimes prior to the moment that they resigned within the last, whatever it was, in the last 13 months. So I don't think that they're acquitting themselves very well, those who work for these major news organs, because they seem to just, even if they don't feel good about it inside, nevertheless go along with what they've been participating in, and often enough willingly and enthusiastically, it would seem. So I think that historically, it's not going to look very good for them when the people look back at the role that media played in enabling this genocide to happen.
It seems like they were more excited about sparing critics of the genocide policy, the support of the genocide policy, like Rashida Tlaib or the student occupiers or what have you, than anything else.
Absolutely. That's been one of the ways that you could argue this has been perhaps even incitement genocide in a form, right? To seek to delegitimize, intimidate, smear those who have been doing what they can to try to stop it, right? That's just as bad as saying, hey, what Israel and America are doing is good. If you contrive, right, and just outright lie and make up accusations against anti-genocide protesters, that's functionally the same as if you're saying, burn as many Palestinians alive as you can. And that's something that I would like to write about and study further, but I haven't yet. But it does play a big part in the propaganda for sure, if not genocide incitement. And we see that with every U.S. war that it's directly involved in, whether that's Iraq or Vietnam or whatever it is, this attacking of dissidents. And yeah, that's been a pervasive part of the coverage here, and a rather, I think, despicable one when you consider that so much of the opposition has been student-led, and you have a lot of basically well-off people in positions of power seeking to destroy the future of younger people, if not bring them physical harm, because those younger people are out there putting their bodies and their career prospects on the line to try to stop probably the worst crime of the century.
Right. One last kind of follow up on that. One of the things that I think is really chilly, more than the whole thing is, but journalists are being targeted by Israel. We know that. It's not, I don't think it's questionable anymore. Wouldn't that be the kind of thing that would, even if these media or Zionist influenced, wouldn't the fact that journalists are being targeted and assassinated and killed along with UN workers and doctors, wouldn't that be enough? Is there any uproar about that? Have any of the major groups like CAD or Pulitzer judges or has anybody like actually spoken out about that?
At last check, not with regard to the 6 journalists in Gaza that Israel effectively told us it was going to kill early last week when it said, oh, they're affiliated with Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a way of just giving the advance notice to say, oh, see, that's why we had to kill them. No, as of earlier today, there had been nothing done to try to protect those 6 from becoming Israel's latest journalistic victims. And the extent to which there's been any murmurs about the mass killing of journalists, frankly, that has happened in these 13 months, it really pales in comparison to much lighter forms of repression, which I'm not apologizing for or minimizing, of journalists by enemy states, say Russia, for example, where they had the Wall Street Journal journalist detained for a long period. I don't support that or think it's good, but the point is that got orders of magnitude more attention than Israel going much further and just outright murdering with sniper bullets and bombs these heroic journalists on the front line in Gaza. So again, a lot of the major international journalistic organizations have really disgraced themselves, as have so many cultural and political and economic institutions over these last 14 months. But they'll be vindicated, but they already are. They'll be remembered, and the martyred Palestinian journalists will be the ones who in the future will be highlighted, possibly not by the Pulitzer, but by the next generation of journalists who get into it for the right reasons and who hopefully have places to go for a living that aren't CNN or the New York Times.
I think we can wrap it there. Want to thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Sorry again about the tech issues.
Folks, we've been talking with Professor Greg Shupak, who's a professor of media studies at the University of Guelph-Humber in Toronto, and then author of The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. And you're listening to the Green Red Podcast. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. And if you really like us, check us out at greenredpodcast.network. You hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And everybody out there, make a lot of trouble, misbehave. Talk to you again soon.